Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Richard Smith with the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, and I am thrilled today to have a very special guest, Dr. Brian von Herzen, who is you'll get to know him over the course of our conversation. I think you'll be as excited as I am about this conversation, and also the founder of the Climate Foundation. Welcome, Brian.
Oh, thank you, Richard. It's a real pleasure to be here.
And I do want to start out with a little nod to our mutual friend, Ben Hunt, and his epsilon theory, because we've met through Ben's work, as I've met many wonderful people through Ben's work. So, and I know we're both very interested in Ben's work and follow his epsilon theory. And it's a great compliment to all we're going to talk about today.
I got to know Ben from his proof of plant work, where he wanted to, move from proof of work or proof of stake to proof of plant. And that's what we're going to talk about today a little bit. And that is, how do you prove the plants that you grow, and how does that help the primary production of the planet?
Yeah. And Brian, I'm so interested in your kind of history and how it recapitulates what I think a lot of people are experiencing right now, is that you really started out in physics, right? So you have a very strong background in physics from Princeton University, right? Although you worked in Milankovitch cycles, which is very interesting, and I want to talk about that. So basically, you've been involved with the planetary sciences for, it sounds like, all your life, pretty much. And then you go into computer science and planetary sciences at Caltech, master's and PhD. And then you head out to the Woods Hole Oceanography Institute in Massachusetts, where you get into biology. And so as the executive director and chair of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, I'm really looking at this kind of interplay between physics and biology. And so I'm so fascinated with your work and what you're doing, and really looking forward to sharing some of it with our audience. But if you could just kind of start by talking a little bit about your own personal journey and history through all these different disciplines and how you got to where you are today, I think that would be really interesting.
Sure thing, Richard. I grew up on Cape Cod. My father was an oceanographer in Woods Hole, and he taught me to swim and dive. I was probably 2 years old when he had me out on a surf mat riding waves, and that was my imprinting. So I was kind of connected to the ocean ever since then. I was in high school on Cape Cod, and I took a geology course. And it turns out all of Cape Cod is like a terminal moraine of a glacier from the last 10,000 years. And the islands, Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, were formed by an earlier glaciation. And so I was really intrigued that we were living on a giant sandbar. And what was it that caused this? So in high school, I did a paper on the glacial advances that took place 10,000 years ago. And I thought that was pretty cool. And then I was at Princeton in physics, and I did some work there on actually the Milankovitch theory of ice ages. And as asking the question, I went out to the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory at Forrestal campus at Princeton. And my advisor was out there, and he said, well, why don't you look at doing some nonlinear computer modeling of the Earth system? And I did a 2-hemisphere system, north and south. And I took all of the Milankovitch cycles, and that is the angle of obliquity, the longitude of perihelion, and the eccentricity, which each have 26,000 year, 44,000 year, and 102,000 year cycles, and asked how much of the last million years of ice ages could we explain with the Milankovitch system on a nonlinear climate model. And it was interesting. The results of that thesis I did, it's about 70% of the variance that we see over the past half a dozen ice ages over the past million years could be explained with the Milankovitch forcing. In fact, we were in the last few decades just heading into another ice age slowly, but we've canceled that ice age, and now we've got the biggest impulse of greenhouse gases that the planet has seen for 55 million years, or some would argue 251 million years, which is the PETM, that's the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. And those were the biggest extinctions on the planet. So we're dealing with some big impulses here.
So I gather that convinces you that this global warming is anthropocentric.
Yeah, there's clear and compelling evidence at this point. And really, there's three legs to the climate triad, and that is emissions to zero, as we find the most affordable electricity on the planet, according to the International Energy Agency, is solar electricity and battery storage now.
Mm-hmm.
We need to do about 2,400 gigatons of carbon removal to get back to pre-industrial levels. And that's including the amounts that have to come out of the oceans and the soils when we do start getting those levels down. But the only way that we continue with civilization intact is if we get serious about climate repair. And that means starting with local and regional efforts to re-brighten marine clouds that we've lost. If you want to look at secular shifts and cycles, look at the NASA data for the last 40 years. The NASA Ceres satellite measured the amount of marine clouds that we had in the lower atmosphere over the past 40 years, and they've seen a 2% decrease in those marine clouds, which doesn't sound like much. But when you consider that sunlight is 1,000 watts a square meter, and we had, 20 years ago, we had around 0.7 watts per square meter of imbalance. And that is more sunlight coming in than infrared heat going out. And that was slowly warming the ocean. Mm-hmm. Well, in the last 20 years, we've quadrupled that imbalance. So now we're dealing with 2, 3, or 4 watts per square meter excess heat coming in, sunlight coming in, mm-hmm. than heat going out. That imbalance is largely because our planet is dimmer and duller than it was just 20 years ago. And the NASA Ceres satellite shows this, and also the Big Bear Solar Observatory out in California measured the dark side of the moon and looked at how much Earth glow was reflecting off the moon to get an average brightness of the Earth. Oh, well, wow. A dimmer and duller planet Earth is serious news. And the reason it's dimmer and duller is that there are less marine clouds and there's less sea ice. So whatever we can do to re-brighten our planet, physically, intellectually, and morally, is really key to sustaining our civilization. So we're very interested to see how all three legs of the climate triad could apply with interventions like marine permaculture.
I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but would you just give a brief explanation of the Milankovitch cycles and the 100,000, 44, and 26,000 years?
Yes. Well, here's a good example. Did you know that the Earth is closest to the sun in January? Which is a bit counterintuitive.
That's counterintuitive.
That's the cold. So that's because there's something called perihelion, which is when the Earth is closest to the sun. That happens in January. And the opposite, July, which is where we are now, we're the farthest from the sun. And I'm feeling it. I'm pretty cold down here in Australia, but you guys aren't feeling it.
Right.
So imagine 51,000 years from now, that situation's reversed. And you're farthest from the sun in January. Now your winters are going to be colder and your summers are going to be hotter. And it matters because the northern hemisphere has most of the land. Down here, down under, it's mostly ocean, which can buffer itself pretty well. But you get more severe winters because you got more land in the northern hemisphere. So you can see already that we're in the Goldilocks period. In fact, we've just ejected ourselves from the Garden of Eden. We've had Goldilocks for the last 10,000 years. Stable sea level and stable temperatures. We've now hit the bell with such a big hammer that we have ejected ourselves from the Garden of Eden. And, our civilization developed in the Goldilocks period. That period is over. So it's a real wake-up call. So that part's serious, but, some of it is orbital forcing. But I got to tell you, the hammer that we just hit on the atmosphere and the oceans is an order of magnitude bigger than the orbital forcing.
So let's talk a little bit about your current work in marine permaculture, I think you call it, but if you could give us a little illustration of what you're doing, particularly around the seaweed forests that you're helping to regenerate. And then what I really want to look at together is I find your solution so inspiring from the sense of its simplicity, right? Where you have all of these other efforts going on to like say, develop artificial general intelligence and have massive data centers, and somehow this is going to solve our problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think what you're doing is so beautifully cooperative with nature, and it seems potentially much more impactful to me, at least. And just looking at that and how kind of the paradigms of the culture that we're in and some of the shifts that I think the Foundation for the Study of Cycles is ultimately interested in, and I see you actually, realizing. So, would you give us a brief introduction to your current work?
Yes, and just as a preface, I want to say that the problem of these disruptions that we're dealing with is food security, global food security. It turns out the Earth system is stable in an ice age, and it's stable with no ice on the planet. So these are two stability points of the Earth system. Now, the ice age is great. Life loves an ice age. There's lots of productivity. It's not a problem. The real challenge is when we look at the PETM 50 million years ago or 250 million years ago, you're looking at a planet that has enough productivity for maybe 1 billion people and not 10 billion people in terms of primary production. Now, there are some tech ways of doing that. Stellar is an example.
PETM?
That's the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And so we had a major thermal maximum around 50 million years ago. But the biggest one, the biggest shock was probably the Permian mass extinction, or PME, as they call it. And that Permian mass extinction 251 million years ago, that was, I mean, I think you lost 90+% of all species on the planet. Wow. I mean, it was devastating. And yet we're looking at that scale of an event right now. And so there's a combination of what I'm going to call secular shifts and the way our economy and our psychology responds and rings when you get a secular shift. I think it's helpful to understand both, because that secular is like the impulse, and then the response is the cycle.
Yes, very interested in that. When you say that we've left the Garden of Eden, we've rung the bell, would that have happened without the industrialization, or is it industrialization that has actually, ejected us out of this period of relative climate benignity?
Yeah, it is industrialization. I mean, look, business as usual, the Milankovitch cycle, we were heading into another ice age.
Okay.
Right? We just canceled that ice age and we gave it an impulse.
That's what I thought you said. I just wanted to be clear about that. So.
No, thanks for clarifying. Yeah. And, like it or not, we've hit the bell. The bell has not stopped ringing yet. And I will tell you, there are a lot of folks that aren't really interested in climate disruption, but climate disruption is interested in them and interested in their property and their homes and their families and the way their children futures will survive. And so it's the challenge is the Earth system. We're dealing with delayed and amplified responses, and that means the responses that we're going to see are delayed.
Yep.
They're also amplified. And if you look at sea level rise, it's been stable for a long time, but we can account for 200 millimeters of sea level rise, but it's not linear. This is actually a parabola, right? And so we're looking at this kind of thing. And the Earth system is capable of about 10 feet of sea level rise in 100 years. So imagine every port in America, and in the world for that matter, 10 foot higher sea level. That's what we're looking at in coming decades, potentially. That's what the Earth system is capable of.
All right.
And so that's some of the sobering things that we have to deal with. There are ways to address it.
Not great, but excellent explanation. Thank you.
The thing is, if we do wake up on this, there's a lot we can do when it comes to emissions to zero, carbon removal, and climate repair. And that climate repair starts with local and regional marine cloud rebrightening. There are efforts at Cambridge University and elsewhere to restore sea ice. And I think all of those can be done, and can be done with probably less than 1% of gross domestic product. So it is doable.
All right. Well, can you show us a little bit of what you're working on today?
Sure. I've got marine permaculture slides. They're up there. Thank you very much. And we call it marine permaculture, and it's our work at the Climate Foundation. And we're very happy to have been awarded an XPRIZE for carbon removal milestone award that recognized the potential for carbon removal with this nature-based and nature-inspired solution. So,
Congratulations on that. That's pretty incredible.
thank you so much. I appreciate it. I think we're dealing with a lot of challenges from the west coast of the U.S. to the coasts of Australia. We've seen losses of 90 to 95%. In a warmer ocean, there's less nutrient at the surface, plenty of nutrients down below. And the problem is you get this nutrient value chain gap. We talk about value chains in the economy. Well, nature's economy tokens are all measured by nutrients, the nitrate and the phosphate, and the exchange of nutrients across ecosystems and across species. Right. So we can think in terms of value chains in the ocean. And we got to keep that nutrient supply chain going in order to keep the plants growing. Every other breath we take comes at oxygen is that half the oxygen is produced from the ocean. So
I love and hate that you called it nature's tokens. Because that is how we're thinking today, right? We're thinking in terms of tokens and not in terms of nature.
Well, exactly. It's just a natural, it's a way of keeping score, I suppose. Yeah. But the reality is we look at primary production in the ocean as exemplified on this red chart here with all that hot ocean. Mm-hmm. And that is a barrier to the supply of deep nutrients that keeps the microalgae going and the macroalgae. And the reason that matters is about half the oxygen production on the planet comes from the ocean. It's the second lung of our planet. And yet in the subtropics here, that's down 30 or 40% in terms of primary productivity just from the ocean warming. So it's a big deal. And, over 90% of that global warming goes into the ocean. So there's a lot of heating there, and it's somewhat unprecedented. That's resulted in 60% losses in the tropics of seaweed crops, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and 90% in some of the temperate kelp regions. So we've been working on what could we do to fill those nutrient value chain gaps that are created by climate disruption. And that's where we came up with this marine permaculture, really a circular economy to keep things going. And it's founded in permaculture design principles. So there's a dozen permaculture design principles, which I think apply equally well in investing environments as they do in terrestrial cultivation and horticulture. And as we find out, marine mariculture also does really well with these principles. We've detailed these with one of the fathers of permaculture, and that is Dave Holmgren, along with Dr. Scott Spilius. We wrote this article last year, and that is really trying to understand how do we apply these dozen permaculture design principles to the marine environment. We call it marine permaculture, to the social environment, and how do we do distributed governance. And I wonder if it might not apply to the investing environment. Could we take these principles? They are so fundamental and so profound. Living on the edge, catching and storing energy, observe and interact, obtain a yield. All of these, I think, apply to the investing environment. So I think we should come back and talk about permaculture design principles for investment cycles.
And we could use some improvement in markets, that's for sure.
That's great. And so all of this inspired us to create our marine permaculture platform. Think of this like a 40-meter diameter pizza. It's more than 100 feet in diameter. And this platform not only provides a substrate for seaweed to grow on, but every night we lower this platform to absorb nutrients down in the deep. And every sunrise, we bring it back to the surface. It's interesting because 5 years ago, we were just upwelling seawater with solar energy, and that was fine. But it takes about 100 times more energy to do that. So we've shifted over to deep cycling. We take Mohammed to the mountain, and that is bring the seaweed platform, which is neutrally buoyant, down at night. The seaweed acts like a sponge and absorbs nitrate, phosphate, micronutrients below the thermocline where the ocean gets cool and it's got a lot more nutrients.
Wow.
So soaks up nutrients all night. At sunrise, we've got small electric motors that bring the seaweed platform back to the surface. And there it absorbs sunlight and carbon dioxide in the top meter of the sea all day. And I'll tell you, we went from red seaweed production of around 100% growth per month, which is pretty good. And we got it up to 200, even 300% per month, which we're really happy with. And then we found some green seaweed hitchhikers that'll grow 100% per day. I mean, look, if we can get all the other costs down, I'll take that compounding rate. I mean, literally, we've got to hoover up the green seaweed twice a week to keep up with it.
Oh
And,
my goodness.
and that produces food and feed and fertilizer with zero inputs. And that's what we call a marine stellar technology. No inputs, no toxic outputs. Once we build it, it's going to produce for decades.
Incredible. And to me, the principles behind this are what fascinate me so much in a world where we're trying to do so much engineering and so much quantification and computation. You've just done something very simple using principles of cycles and achieved almost, what if it was an engineering feat would be called a miracle, right?
Well, I've got to credit the nature-inspired solutions, because it turns out there's a zillion organisms called deal migrators that come up at night to the surface to feed off the plankton and go down during the day. And there's a diurnal cycle of the just 100-meter commute that happens all the time. The sharks come up, the little micro copepods, they come up and they eat the algae. In fact, there's these gelatinous salps. They'll eat 75% of all the plankton grown during the night. That's how efficient they are. And then they go back down and they poop out the output, and the poop carries a lot of carbon with it and sinks the carbon. And so
what we're looking at here, this is seaweed there.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And what is this seaweed doing? Is it for people to eat? Is it for carbon sequestration? All the above? Yeah. And normally I think of seaweed as sort of like a forest, right? So, I mean, if you're bringing it all up, does it just kind of crunch up at the top there? Or does it never really grow into a forest?
Well, these tropical red seaweeds are shown here on the left. They grow about 1 foot in diameter. And then the bigger kelps can grow 20, 30 meters long. So they can be even longer than that. And so it's a combination. In the tropics, it tends to be more smaller seaweeds, but they grow very quickly. Like the green seaweed grows very quickly. And it's a common, we found a dozen incredible uses for seaweed. It's really a superfood. And I eat a little seaweed every day, and look what's happened to me. So you don't know it, but I'm the better part of 100 years old.
So I saw you finished your undergrad in 1980. So I figured you were older than you look.
Yeah, exactly. So I do recommend a little seaweed every day. But all jokes aside, the first three markets are food, feed, and fertilizer. So you may not be aware, but toothpaste and ice cream and texturizers, carrageenan, and all sorts of hydrocolloids are common food ingredients. In fact, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. On top of that, it turns out you can get a lot healthier fish and a lot healthier livestock if you add up to 1/4 of their diet can be seaweed. And that's a great feed supplement. In fact, if you feed chickens seaweed, you'll get omega-3 eggs and omega-3 chickens. And so that's great for, all the nutrients and all the rest. And then finally, our very first market actually is what we call a biostimulant. And it turns out a seaweed foliar biostimulant will dramatically rev up your plants, whether you've got a garden at home or horticulture or broadacre agriculture. Literally, you take 1 liter of seaweed juice, that's 1 quart, and you think of it like aerial crop dusting, or these days we'd use drones. 1 liter per hectare, that's 2.5 acres per week. It's tiny amount, diluted 100 to 1. That's enough to get crop yields up 15 to 30% with 20% less fertilizer. And that's replete fertilizer situation. It's amazing that you can get that extra growth rate just because you spray this on in the morning. There are these little holes in the leaves of the plants called stomata, and the seaweed biostimulant goes in through the stomata and upregulates the gene expression of the plants and improves the uptake efficiency of those nutrients into the plant. And so it's this amazing synergy. All the land plants on Earth used to be green algae. So they're responding to all these plant growth regulators. And to this day, even the folks in the industry who've been in this industry for half a century, we do not know all the reasons that these plant growth regulators work so well, but they do.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, there are plant growth regulators, but it's not enough to explain the observed behavior. I think it's actually the healthy soil microbial communities that get facilitated by this by the seaweed foliar biostimulants. And what it does is it actually facilitates a healthy soil microbial community, and it's the synergy between the microbes, which is the unseen masses in the soil, and the plant that actually make it all work. And I've ran into a very interesting statistic, and that is, what single factor determines nutrition in your vegetables more than anything else?
I have no idea.
Well, you think maybe it's biodynamic or organic or, no pesticides or maybe something like that, but it's not. It turns out the respiration of the soil is what determines the nutrition in your plants. And that is take a pound of soil, put it in a Tupperware, let it go for 4 hours, put a little CO2 detector in there, and you can see how much CO2 was respired by that pound of soil over the last 6 hours. And that it's a 100-year-old experiment, but it tells you how much is your soil alive. And it turns out the more alive your soil is, the more nutritious your vegetables are.
Fantastic. So this platform here, you're just lowering it down into the ocean 100 feet at night and then raising it back up.
Yeah, it's more about
and you're using solar energy.
That's right. Marine solar energy. Here's kind of a schematic of it. And here in the tropics, we need to go down 300, 400 feet in order to get past this thermocline to where the nutrients are higher. Off the coast of California and the west coast of Americas, you might go 150 feet. You might actually get the nutrients at that level. But the deeper you go, the higher the nutrients get. And so it's really that combination that provides great results. I mentioned the red seaweeds were getting us 100% up to 300% per month, but we haven't even charted the green seaweeds, which you can see in this little smaller version of the pizza. And we see this across multiple years from 2020 through 2023, and really great results even to the present time. And so really, this has been about exponential growth. In phase 1, we worked with the University of Hawaii and proved that upwelling works well. In phase 2, we showed that the troughs of deep water would grow the seaweed much better. Phase 3, we've been scaling up from 100 square meters to 1,000 square meters. And now I'm happy to say we're at 2,500 square meters, and that's the picture on the lower right. And that's a big, think of it like a big spider web. We got 4 of our traction buoys, think of them like marine tractors, sea tractors, and they raise and lower the platform every day with their little solar panels at the top. We've got a little tender boat here, and you can we're beginning to grow that green seaweed. And literally over the next 6 to 12 months, we're going to go from 2,500 square meters to the fully commercial 10,000 square meters. That's a full hectare of marine permaculture, which we hope to replicate 1,000 times in 1,000 communities around the world.
And Brian, you're doing this as a not-for-profit foundation?
Yes, we are very grateful for small contributions, small and large, from our supporters around the world. We recently got a small grant from the CO2 Foundation, which is based on Pacific Northwest, and they help provide funding that will get us to the first 10,000 square meters. But literally, I think this is a great opportunity to invest in our futures. I quit my day job in Silicon Valley. I spent 3 decades designing systems on a chip in Silicon Valley, and now we're designing systems on a ship in the Pacific Ocean to address the fundamental gaps we have, in primary production on our seas and soils.
I really want to get into that. But so the reason that this is necessary to do is because with the warming of the oceans, we're not getting the circulation of the nutrients.
That's right.
To feed the seaweed, right? Is that the issue? So you're kind of artificially recreating that circulation to get the nutrients exposed and to accelerate the growth of the seaweed through some very simple engineering. I mean, nothing very complicated here, right?
Exactly.
You didn't need artificial intelligence to do this.
That's true. Although we are using it. We got a small award from the
Mm-hmm.
Bezos Earth Fund,
Mm-hmm.
Greenhouse
Okay.
Gas Innovation, to actually take daily drone shots of that that seaweed on the top right, and correlate that with the ground truth we're getting. We're doing a multi-year study with 4 universities: Princeton, Rutgers, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and the National Taiwan University, to study the carbon cycling underneath the seaweed ring. And so we can fully understand what's going on with the carbon cycle. Those results will complete the data taking this year and get those results out next year. And it's our intention for that to form the basis of a gold standard for carbon removal, that we can work in the ocean to really regenerate and restore the kind of ocean productivity that we had pre-industrially.
That sounds very ambitious.
Oh, thanks. Well, it's one step at a time. But, I think when it comes to predicting trends,
Yeah.
we tend to over predict what we can do in the short term, but
Mm.
under predict what we can do in the long term.
Mm.
And that's why, we quit our day jobs in the last decade, and we're all in on regenerating life on an ocean planet Earth.
Incredible. And again, the benefits are, one, food and fertilizers, and
That's right.
you're doing carbon sequestration.
Yes.
How does that work?
Well, you end up getting all 3 at once. So these are, as I mentioned, the top 3 here are food, feed, and fertilizer. That's the top 3 on the left, but it's a dozen value chains: food security, biofuels, fibers, all the rest. And we can get into those value chains one by one. We're starting with the fertilizer side of it. And the way it works is, while we're growing the seaweed on these platforms here, about a quarter of all the seaweed falls off during growth and sinks 1,000 meters a day to the abyssal seafloor, where it can remain for centuries in the cold water. In fact, the water that we're cultivating with here in Australia has got to go all the way to Canada before it upwells to the surface again. So that's about 500 to 1,000 years of sequestration. But it doesn't end there. It turns out, when you've got subtropical coral rubble and calcium sediments and all the rest, when the seaweed falls and hits the seafloor, it gets digested by little microfauna. It gets respired into CO2. But the CO2 in those pore spaces between the seaweed and the coral sediments, the coral rubble, that actually lowers the pH with the carbonic acid, and it dissolves some of the coral rubble, forms a dissolved material called calcium bicarbonate. Now, calcium carbonate is just seashells, right? That's solid. But when you form calcium bicarbonate, that's dissolved in the ocean, and that'll remain in the ocean for 100,000 years. So if we dissolve a little coral rubble, we're actually buffering the ocean. And that's true for shallow seaweeds and deep seaweeds. So it's a great way, and it's a new mechanism, really, to account for and provide really long-term sequestration of carbon in the oceans. There's a huge amount of room in the oceans, right? There's 45 times as much carbon in the oceans as the entire atmosphere. So it's great. You could take all the CO2 in the atmosphere, put it evenly distributed throughout the middle and deep ocean, and you would change the total carbon in the ocean by about 2%.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah. So a lot of benefits. I think we can actually manage the intensity of typhoons if you have 1,000 permacultures out there, and you can keep the surface of the ocean cooler with a combination of these seaweeds. And the seaweeds give off these biogenic cloud condensation nuclei that help to rebrighten the marine clouds. Mark Twain said back in the 1800s, "The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco." And the reason he said that was it's so cold and cloudy there, right? And well, it turned out in the 1800s, there were vast kelp beds that were contributing those biogenic cloud condensation nuclei and keeping the place really, really cloudy. In fact, a lot cloudier than it was in the 1900s or 2000s. And rebrightening those marine clouds is going to be key to keeping our civilization on track with healthy climate and productive seas and productive soils for food security. And so that's something we need to pay a lot of attention to as we go forward. And so those are just a few of the benefits. But as I mentioned, the first product we have is this Big Grow biostimulant. We're already entering Philippine markets, and we are planning to import some of this biostimulant to the US and also to Australia. where we can do a lot of good, because believe it or not, these biostimulants only have a 3 to 4% market adoption in the US. Now imagine if you could cut your fertilizer bill by 20% and increase yields by 15 to 30% through droughts and heat waves. Now we're talking. So this is a real good prescription, I would say, for sustaining agriculture going forward. And, it costs about $10 a hectare to do a crop dusting with an airplane. But I figured out the drone is the 21st century rifle. We've got economics down to $1 per hectare for drone application of these biostimulants. So, everyone's got to learn to fly a drone, and the drone is the 21st century rifle for the farmer.
Incredible. Really incredible.
Oh, thank you. Some of our results, the best metric that we have found is fertilizer specific yield. And that is how many sacks of rice do you get for every sack of fertilizer? So the orange bars are our control farms. We've done 100 rice trials in the Western Pacific. And amazingly, we're getting 2 to 6 times the fertilizer specific yield in 2023 and 2024 as with the controls. And so it's this great metric on how much are we boosting productivity, and very happy with these results. And this is going to be transformational, I think, for where we're going. And it makes such a difference to coastal communities, seaweed farmers, fishermen, rice farmers, and the coastal communities that can turn the raw seaweed into biostimulant. So we've really appreciated working with over, hundreds of seaweed farmers and rice farmers so far.
Wow.
So it's the overall plan. We've got this value chain. We think for every square kilometer of marine permaculture we put out there, we can probably sequester or avoid 30,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. And that's about 8,000 tons sinking in the deep ocean, 12,000 tons because it's less fertilizer we had to make, and 10,000 tons, which is 20% less nitrogen fertilizer, means 20% less nitrous oxide emissions, which is a greenhouse gas with about 300 times the forcing of carbon dioxide. So that's our 40-meter pizza. We're thrilled to be making this innovation. We call it a marine stellar technology because my good friend at Stanford, Tony Seba, and his colleague, James Arbib, have identified the opportunity to transform our industry to stellar technologies that once a stellar seed is in place, we do not need to extract more inputs, and we don't need to produce toxic outputs to really build a sustainable, abundant civilization. So I'm enthused to add this chapter of, let's say, a bit of technology to the quiver that can help us generate really tribes of abundance from what we may have in economics of scarcity in our fraught times here in the 2020s. So it's about food security, it's about ecosystems, but ultimately it's about getting people and 8 million other species to thrive on ocean planet Earth.
All right. Are we good with the slides? Do we finish with the slides?
We're all set.
Beautiful. So let's talk about that economic scarcity versus tribes of abundance, because boy, it sure seems like the scarcity mindset is we're all experiencing it so intensely right now. And I'm so interested in, your journey from physics to biology, from Silicon Valley to seaweed platforms, from, I'm sure a for-profit entity to a not-for-profit entity, from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. And what are stellar technologies, by the way? I don't think people know what that is.
Well, we've had 10,000. Yeah, we've had 10,000 years of extraction, and I think it started when we moved from an agrarian lifestyle. And I was really surprised to learn that Homo sapiens is 300,000 years old, which is amazing. They just found some Homo sapien skeletons in Morocco, which is amazing that for 97% of our existence, we lived in nomadic and non-extractive, really, civilization or society.
Right.
Only the last 3%, the last 10,000 years, did we shift to agriculture. And humanity is great at turning forests into deserts. You've heard the cedars of Lebanon. Well, I've looked, and there's like 1 or 2 acres left in Lebanon. Right? I mean, that's in the Bible, right? There was abundant cedars of Lebanon. So
Right.
just as an example, but we've got so many examples of turning forests into deserts.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I think we're right at the cusp of learning and knowing how to turn deserts and depleted lands back into prime productivity. And that's
Mm-hmm.
about building soil regenerative agriculture. And that's really through a deeper understanding of the healthy soil microbial communities that keep the soils alive
Mm-hmm.
and the healthy marine communities that keep the oceans alive. And
Mm.
that starts with the algae. It starts with, they call it primary production for a reason, because these plants on land and sea turn inorganic nutrients into carbohydrates, you
Right.
know, and that's where it all starts, right? All of us have to depend on plants for our survival, directly or indirectly, and so that's an opportunity. And um, so I think it's important to realize that 97% of our DNA evolution, if you will, for the human species was in a non-extractive environment, and it's only really this last bits. And you'd go and you'd slash and burn, and and have a crop for
Yeah.
5 years or 10 years, and then the soil kind of depletes, and then they'd have to move on. And if there's some neighbor that's got land that's good and your land isn't good, then you go and use grab the neighbor's land and start using that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the extraction that's the problem. And I'd say a recent chapter in this, 600 years ago, was the island of Madeira, which was a beautiful tropical rainforest. And around 1415, some Western European colonialists, if you will, came over and used a combination of slave labor and whatnot to grow sugarcane and send those sugar cubes to England. And it became more and more popular. And after 5 or 10 years, the soil was depleted and they had to move on.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an extractive mindset, right, that goes on. But what's amazing about where we live right now in this decade is that we've got, the IEA has said, look, solar is the cheapest electricity in history, cheaper than oil, cheaper than coal.
Mm-hmm.
We can actually, there's a positive net present value to being green. And by leaning into solar, and I just heard that China has installed 600 gigawatts of solar and has a production capacity between 2 and 400 gigawatts. And yet we're not even using all that production capacity. But if we could, and I hope we can do that here in Australia and around the world,
Mm-hmm.
we can lean into this stellar abundance. It starts with an abundance of energy, and that is the price of solar has dropped over 90% in the last decade. And according to the stellar book by Tony Seba and Arbib,
Right. So I don't think people know what stellar means and what
right,
stellar is. So
I
can you
think,
tell us a little bit about that?
yeah, I define it as a set of technologies that move us from an extractive process
Okay.
to something where you build a system like
Yes.
solar and batteries, right? Once
Yes.
you build it, you will get decades of electricity, and
Right.
the battery system can work for thousands of cycles. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a company out on the West Coast called Redwood Materials that recycles 98% of the elements that are in an old battery and recycles it into a new battery. And by the
Mm-hmm.
way, it takes many times less cobalt and less lithium to produce a kilowatt hour on today's battery than yesterday's battery. So you can actually get a multiplier benefit. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's that circular economy that enables the reuse and recycling of these materials. And
Yeah.
so the stellar technology set is realizing that once we build a stellar core that includes solar, wind, and batteries for energy abundance,
Mm-hmm.
that includes precision agriculture, precision mariculture, and precision fermentation for food abundance, and an abundance of labor. These are the secular shifts that we're going to see in the next decade or two. That means that we're living at a really unique time. And that is, for the first time in about 10,000 years, we've got an opportunity to transcend extractive processes and build communities that have stellar abundance. And what I mean by that is, you get a stellar core in place, you don't need to extract more
Yeah.
in the way of minerals or land or whatnot. We know how to do regenerative agriculture. Precision agrivoltaics is what it's called. And that is where you've got solar, PV, and agriculture on the same acres of land. And it's amazing to look at those trends, because the Stellar book really talks about what are the price trends that we can look at that are going to drive the adoption, if you will. It's like going from the horse buggy to the automobile. That happened in like 15 years in New York, right? Years ago. The same transition is happening now with stellar energy. And that is, once you build it, you're going to get decades of production, and then you can recycle it afterwards. That is going to transform the cost of energy. We're looking at another 80% cost reduction in batteries over the next 10 years, according to the Stellar book, and another 70% cost reduction in solar photovoltaics, which is one of those secular shifts that will drive cycles. And and the way that our markets respond to these secular shifts is something we should really understand well. So that's the step, right? And the question is, what is the step response? How do we actually come around? But that's an abundant future, because it means every member of that stellar community can have an abundance of energy, and you don't have to depend on the power bill, and really it's a bottom-up grassroots approach to energy, which we're seeing across Australia here. The Prime Minister of Australia just put in some massive benefits for home energy solar systems. So you can actually buy a home, you can get something like $15,000 back on a 50 kilowatt hour home battery system, which is about half the cost of the battery system now. So everyone is leaning into, okay, let's build home energy storage systems. And that's going to address 80% of the power need, and the power grid is going to be, just kind of a top up on a cloudy day.
Wow.
What's amazing, Saul Griffith has spent years consulting with the Department of Energy, and he recommends, we used to design solar systems for your home. You'd put in 5 kilowatts of solar, or 10 or something. But he's saying go to 25 or 30 kilowatts, because at 8 cents a watt, which is the price of solar in China today, it's cheaper to put in 30 kilowatts of solar. And now on the cloudiest day of winter, you're going to have 25 kilowatt hours to run your house for 24 hours. And you don't need to put in more than 16 hours of battery, because the sun's going to come up tomorrow. And so, you're going to have that solar. And now guess what? You've got enough energy to run your house on a cloudy day. But on a sunny day, you have stellar abundance, right? Because you've got enough to charge your car and run your electric appliances and run your home business and probably run an AI supercomputer and your robots, right? Yeah. So the point is, that is stellar abundance, clear and simple, right? That is the definition of stellar. But it's like Amazon. Amazon had to design their servers for the busiest day of the Christmas buying season. The rest of the year, they sell the computer time as Amazon Web Services. That is computational abundance. And that's really the key to an abundance mindset for energy. For food, what's amazing is precision fermentation. They've figured out how, with microbes, to make scrambled egg proteins and all sorts of nutrients, even omega-3 fatty acids in Nebraska they're making with precision fermentation these days. What's interesting is looking at the price trends. If you want a secular shift, in 2020, the price of protein was $100 a kilo that you'd make in a beer vat with a typical, beer vat type process, precision fermentation. In 2025, the price of that protein is $10 a kilo, which is competitive for vegan dairy, the UHT treated milk and all the rest. And so right now that, that'll affect the dairy industry over the next 5 years. And in 2030, the price of protein will be $1 a kilo. So that's an order of magnitude shift again. There's a factor of 100 from 2020 to 2030. Right. And that's when you start displacing livestock. Right. So literally, they still have Wagyu beef and all the rest. You pay $100 a pound for it. But for $1 a kilo, 50 cents a pound, you're going to have your scrambled eggs. You're going to have your precision protein. And I would complement that with precision agrivoltaics. And that's where on a single acre, you run your vegetables and you run your vertical bifacial panels, and you get early morning sunlight and late afternoon sunlight for your electricity. In the middle of the day, your vegetables get plenty of sunlight. And now you're growing your fiber, and you want whole foods, mostly plants, not too much. That plus precision protein, we're going to have an abundance of food for every member of that stellar community. So
I,
that's the
I
second
love it.
chapter, right?
Yeah,
And I've got to quote Tony Seba. He said, no incumbent technology ever survives a factor of 10 in price difference.
that's for sure.
So we're going to see that. We're going to see that displacement, and that's big.
So,
Robotaxi is another one. I just looked it up today. It's $2 or $3 a mile for an Uber, or operating your car or whatever.
mhm.
And the robotaxis, you're looking at 20 to 30 cents a mile in the future
Mm.
for the cost of that automatic driving service. So there's another order of magnitude
I mean,
shift.
automobiles are so ridiculously expensive today.
Did you know that a third of the area of Los Angeles is parking?
I grew up in Los Angeles, so I believe it.
I mean, that's an area abundance. What can we
Yeah,
do? I mean, can we make separated bikeways? Can we
right.
make community gardens?
Yeah,
What are the innovations we can
right.
bring in? In fact, I'm
Mm,
looking at really ecologically sustainable suburban development housing. And there are some great things we can do. One of the best examples is Davis, California Village Homes back in the 1970s
mhm.
inverted the house structure and kind of deprecated the roads to little driveways. And then the backyard became the community interaction place for the community garden, the community orchard. They
Mhm.
even have vineyards and orchard trees and whatnot. And
Mhm.
that's where you interact with your neighbors, is in the backyard. You get
Yes.
rid of the back fences. You have a private front yard.
Yes.
And
Love it.
just amazing. I loved it, because in those areas they put swales for the water, they put walkways and bikeways and scooterways these days that are permeable, so you can actually go through the community, and you've got local residents, and that's how you build community. The founder Judy says there are two things you need to build community, and that is a place to gather and a reason to gather. And I
Mm.
think it's that community water management, community gardens and whatnot, that build community in a neighborhood. And
Yeah.
so I'd love to see that spread across sustainable development around the world. I think we've
Mhm.
got a great opportunity to do something that is going to lay the foundations for these stellar communities going forward, that are going to be a lot more about local food production. Now that we've got internet everywhere, you might as well enjoy a place with acreage and a
Are you
place
seeing
where
this trickle down to the homesteading movement yet?
I think it is. And there's a lot of eco village work happening here in Australia, where
Mhm.
they first developed permaculture decades ago.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of development. Sunshine Coast is a great example. The Sunshine Coast Council just qualified as a United Nations biosphere reserve just in 2022.
Mm.
And they need to file a report in 2032 before the Summer Olympics in Brisbane. And they need to show ecologically sustainable development. And it's this kind of sustainable development that is going to enable people to have a food forest in their backyard. Maybe it's not so much grass, but a food forest. I'm really appreciating. So I'm seeing that as a trend, especially with
Mhm.
regenerative
Mm.
horticulture, regenerative agriculture. It's a
Exactly.
great opportunity, and it's a higher quality of living in many ways. I mean, it's great to
Absolutely.
go into the city, and we just went in this week and met with some engineering friends for a stellar engineering lunch, which
That's
was great,
fun.
planning the future.
Yeah.
But when it comes to raising your family, having a neighborhood, all the rest, it's Amory Levins likes to say, ship the electrons and leave the heavy nuclei at home. And what that means is you and me talking online,
Mhm.
and I didn't have to fly 20,000 kilometers to meet you on
Right.
the East Coast.
Right. Yes. So as I'm seeing a theme in your work, and tell me if you agree with this, but just taking the seaweed and ocean work, what happened was the cycle of nutrients was disrupted, and you are restoring the cycles, the natural cycles. So you're actually using industrial engineering
Yes,
to restore natural cycles. And
that's right.
even what you're talking about in neighborhoods and communities and people getting together in a natural cycle of community and relationships, all of this is about restoring cycles.
Yes, that is right. I think we can look at permaculture through a cycle lens, and that is observe nature, watch what nature does, what works and what doesn't,
Yeah.
and then make one intervention that has three or four benefits, and helps to sustain those cycles. And the nutrient cycle is a key one in the ocean and in the soils.
Yeah.
And by understanding our nutrient cycles on land and sea, we can help to work with nature rather than opposing nature. And
So
I find that so
bring
effective.
this to markets for a minute. And because, as the foundation for the study of cycles, we go back to 1941. And actually, if you go back further to our chairman, it was 1931 when he gathered a group of wildlife biologists up in Canada for the Matamec conference, which was fascinating. But throughout the history of the foundation, there's been this tension that the reason people give us money is because they want to exploit the cycles for profit, right? So this idea of like cooperating with cycles versus exploiting cycles, right? So typically it's like, oh, we want to use cycles to predict prices in markets so that we can extract more wealth ourselves, right? As opposed to some kind of new model of abundance where you're not having to have that economic scarcity mindset, that kind of, zero sum game mentality. So do you think this could have some impact on markets?
Definitely. And I think I'm reminded, one of my advisors at Caltech was Dick Feynman. And he loved to say, vote with your feet.
He was a friend of the foundation and Edward Dewey.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciated having Dick Feynman on.
That's incredible.
On my thesis committee in the 1980s, right? And so, it's funny because he came into my master's exam and he said, well, this thesis is a little thin for a PhD thesis. And I said, well, that's good because it's a master's thesis. So he said, oh, okay. No problem here. But what I loved that he said is vote with your feet and work on projects that have meaning to you. And that's really what we're doing here is it is providing meaning. In other words, and that's true on investments. In other words, invest in things you really believe in, right? And that have this, that are part of this secular shift, because we can choose to put our abundant capital into extractive technologies or into stellar technologies. And if we vote with our feet on stellar technologies, we can help build the future, which literally is the phoenix that rises from the ashes of the death throes of extractive civilization. I mean, we're looking at these trends. It's pretty scary out there. Does anyone know what work's going to look like in 20 years? I don't think so. No. And yet Stellar has an answer to this, right? Because the cost of robotic labor is $10 an hour in 2025, $1 an hour in 2035, and 10 cents an hour in 2045. So whose job is going to survive 10 cent an hour labor? And those robots are going to be a lot smarter than they are today. I can tell you right now.
So what do you think we're going to be doing in 15 years, Brian?
Well, see, that's the stellar abundance. In other words, by joining a stellar community, right, you will be assured of, we're going to have stellar offtake rights, which means that every member of that community has a right to a slice of the abundant energy, the abundant food security, and the abundant artificial labor when it comes to AI and robotics. And with that, we're going to be very creative. In other words, we're going to be able to create the next thing. I'm really enjoying the kind of intelligence multiplier that you get from AI by working with AI collaboratively. And I think that's the way this is going to evolve. So we're going to be seeing a massive secular shift. Like it or not, our next generation, it's hard for them to buy houses. It's hard for them to start families. It's increasing. And we're seeing that our population's dropping.
Absolutely.
Stellar communities is the answer to that hiatus. In other words, how do we create a stellar community that is a lot more about building stellar abundance and generosity rather than living where we have for the last 10,000 years, and that is an extraction. Now, I think there's a balance, and fundamentally, as I'm seeing it, we're going to, for several decades, are going to be a coexistence of our traditional extractive, processes and stellar communities that are going to have exports, they're going to produce energy and food security and even robotics, um, and, and the imports. In other words, you have to build up a stellar seed. But as we build more and more examples of these stellar communities, I think that is going to be a secular shift in its own right. And that is realizing that we can move towards, and I got to tell you, just in the last year, having read Stellar several times and really progressing it, I can feel within myself an easing of realizing that we don't have to live in economics of scarcity forever, that there is a stellar abundance. I quote Gandhi, who said, look, ocean planet Earth has plenty for every person's need, but not a single man's greed. And so I think we need to understand that there is enough stellar abundance for everyone on the planet, and that in a real sense, we are all brothers and sisters just 55,000 years ago. Every human on the planet has a common mother 55,000 years ago. So recognizing that we are brothers and sisters, Bill Gates has said, every life has equal value. Well, with stellar abundance, there is actually a transition to, doesn't have to be a for-profit world. We're living right in the middle right now with our climate foundation. We have a stellar startup studio that is going to create the sustainable enterprises, the sustainable communities, and we'll attract investment to those, starting with the biostimulant company. We've had 2 spinouts already in biochar and seaweed production. And now we're moving into these food, feed, and fertilizer products. But I think the next thing on the pipeline is really building some of the stellar industries that are going to enable this secular shift that is really the answer of what are our children going to do for work and livelihood in just 10 or 20 years. And that is what I'm going to call the step that we need to accommodate, and then understand the cycles around that secular shift.
Yeah. Fantastic. Brian, if I were just listening to you talk, I might just say it's all theory, but I've seen your work, I've seen what you're doing, and it really validates what you're saying in a very meaningful way. So,
well, thank you. We like to think of ourselves as a think and do tank, and that is not only the vision, but also the boots on the ground and the fins in the water. And that's exactly what we're doing with the ocean and marine permaculture. But also now, I invite everyone to get in touch with us on building stellar communities, and that'll start with solar, wind, and batteries, and it'll continue to precision agrivoltaics, and then we're going to be, in parallel, getting into the artificial labor that we're seeing a revolution unfold as we speak.
Very interesting. So where can people find out more about your work, Brian, and follow along?
Check us out at climatefoundation.org. That's a great place to get started. We are just beginning our Stellar Startup Studio systems. We've been doing it for the last dozen years, but we finally realized that is a core aspect of our work from now on. And really, marine permaculture is a great example of a marine stellar technology. So please get in touch with us at climatefoundation.org. We're always eager to, we can take tax deductible contributions and also expertise. This is going to require a savvy investor business mindset to think, how do we build sustainability into these stellar industries as we go forward?
Love it. And from my perspective, I'm very interested in this idea of restoring cycles and how cycles have been kind of diminished, right? We have a pretty robust cycles detection technology. So if you have any time series data or even stuff that you know of that would make a good research project, could we show a case where it was like, look, cycles were degraded, and you can see it in the historical record, right? The degradation of the cycles, and then restoration of those cycles, and what happens to the ecosystem when that happens.
Definitely. I think there's an annual cycle of sea ice and marine clouds in the last 50 years of NASA data would be a great way to bring that out. We're also seeing some secular shifts. The International Maritime Organization has canceled marine aerosols, which contributes significantly to losing and accelerating the loss of those marine clouds. So soon we're unfortunately getting all the global warming we're paying for with the changes in policy that occurred between 2023. And I don't know if you heard, the Mediterranean is 8 degrees above normal. And it's because they canceled the aerosols in May of 2025. And now we're seeing exploding heat waves across Western Europe. So that's an example of a secular shift. And now we're seeing the bell ringing as a result. It took 1 month to shift that. But the cloud cycles, the marine cycles, and the sea ice cycles, because business as usual, we're going to lose the sea ice in the Arctic in September within the next decade or two. And that's going to make for a very dark ocean with lots of heat. And you know, when you lose the last ice cube in your gin and tonic, it goes up in temperature really quickly. So I don't want that last ice cube to melt. And so that's some of our environmental work. But I think Henry likes to say there's a positive net present value to being green. And that means, you know, let's capture some of that $5 trillion net present value to building ecologically sustainable cycles in the work that we do. And a circular economy is all about cradle to cradle. What do we do with our solar PV materials? What do we do with our batteries? And how do we support those industries that do that reuse and recycling really effectively? I think those economic cycles and circular economy is going to be a great thing to get into in the years ahead. And I'd be happy to work on that with you.
Fantastic. Brian, thank you so much. Really inspiring and so much to think about and so many things in common. So really appreciate it and look forward to definitely keeping in touch and hopefully doing some work together.
Thank you, Richard.
Awesome. And congratulations again on the XPRIZE. That's awesome.
Oh, it's our pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Brian. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you again soon.